He had seen her first on a Tuesday, through the frost-covered glass of the kitchen window, a streak of rust orange moving across the white field with the kind of purposeful silence that made him set down his coffee and lean forward in his chair. She had gone straight to the north wall of the old cellar barn, the one he had not entered in 3 years, not since his legs had stopped cooperating with anything his mind asked of them. She had gone to the base of that wall, the eastern corner specifically, and she had started to dig. Not the random, exploratory digging of an animal investigating a scent. She dug the way someone digs when they already know what is there. He had told himself it was nothing. A mouse, probably. A ground squirrel that had built something underground over the winter. That was what he told himself, and it was an explanation that should have been sufficient. And for the rest of that first morning it was. But she came back on Wednesday, and on Thursday, and on Friday morning she was there before dawn, and Harlan knew because he had started sleeping badly, waking in the cold hours before the sky changed, lying still in the darkness of the room that had been his and Miriam's for 41 years, listening to the silence of the property, the way you listen to silence when you are waiting for it to break. On the morning of the 7th day, she was not alone. He saw the first kit at 7:14, according to the clock on the wall beside the window. A small, dark shape, barely the size of his fist, stumbling out from somewhere beneath the barn's foundation and making its way toward its mother with the shaking, half-coordinated progress of something very recently born. And a second kit, then a third. Harlan Briggs put his hand flat on the glass and did not move it for a long time. She had not been digging to investigate. She had been digging to build. And she had chosen that exact corner, that exact square of frozen earth at the base of the eastern wall of the cellar barn, out of every possible place on 43 acres of rural Pennsylvania land, to place her children. He had not been back to that corner of the property in more than 3 years, but he knew what was there. Or rather, he knew what he had put there. 40 years ago, in the ground beneath that wall, in a space he had dug out by hand on a night in March when the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the ground had still been hard enough to make his palms bleed, Harlan Briggs had buried something that he had spent 4 decades trying to forget. He had been fairly successful, until a fox decided otherwise. What happened in the weeks that followed would not be the kind of story that ends neatly. There is no version of this that resolves cleanly, no moment at which everyone understood everything and forgave everything and walked away lighter. That is not how 40 years of silence works when it breaks. But there is a version in which a man in a wheelchair, with 2 bad legs and 1 bad heart, and a secret that had calcified inside him like a stone, was forced to look at the thing he had buried, and in looking at it, understood for the first time what it had cost him to keep it underground. That version starts here. Harlan had been born in the same county where he would spend his entire life, which was a fact he had never once resented and had almost never thought about. His father had built the main house in 1951. His grandfather had worked the same soil before that, and his grandfather's father before him, and the land itself had a quality that Harlan could not have described in words, but had always known in his body, a kind of low vibration underfoot, like the property itself recognized the weight of whoever was walking on it. He had married Miriam Collier in 1974 in the Lutheran church 4 miles down the road, in a ceremony attended by everyone who would have been offended to be excluded, and several people who came anyway. He had been 27. She had been 25. She had a laugh that started quiet and then took over her whole face, and a way of standing with her arms crossed when she was thinking that he had never stopped finding beautiful. And she had died in the house 11 years ago, of a heart that had worked reliably for 68 years, and then stopped on a Thursday afternoon in October without sufficient warning. After Miriam, Harlan had stayed. There was nowhere else to go. Or rather, there were places. His daughter Celeste in Ohio, his son-in-law's family in Maryland, his granddaughter Marin, who had been asking him to move closer for years. And none of these places were the right answer, because none of them were the land that his grandfather had broken and his father had built, and that he himself had spent 50 years tending. Moving away felt like a kind of death that was worse than the alternative, and Harlan had made peace with that calculus in a way that the people who loved him had not. The wheelchair had come 3 years ago, after the fall on the back porch steps in November, the one that had damaged something in his spine that the surgeon in Harrisburg had explained carefully, and that Harlan had stopped, listening to somewhere around the 3rd paragraph of the explanation. He understood enough. He understood that the legs that had walked this property every day for half a century were done walking it. He understood that the cellar barn, with its uneven stone floor and its narrow doorway, was no longer accessible to him. He understood that 43 acres was now a view from a window. He had adapted to this with a grimness that his family mistook for acceptance. It was not acceptance, but it was functional, and Harlan was a man who valued function over almost everything else. The fox was a problem for several reasons, not all of them the obvious one. The obvious reason was that she had built her den against the foundation of the cellar barn, and the kits, as they grew, would find their way through the gaps in the old stone, and the stone, which was already in a state of managed deterioration, would not benefit from small animals tunneling along its base. He had watched enough springs on this property to know how quickly a managed problem became an unmanaged one. He had called the county extension office on the morning of the 8th day, because that was the responsible thing to do, and the woman who answered had explained, not unkindly, that fox kits born in February were typically mobile enough to relocate with their mother by late March, and that absent any immediate threat to structures, the recommended approach was to wait. Harlan had thanked her and hung up and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The sun was coming up behind the barn, and through the kitchen window he could see the mother fox sitting in the snow near the corner, washing her face with her paw with the brisk efficiency of something that had organized its world and found it satisfactory. One of the kits had emerged and was sitting beside her, identically orange against the white, smaller than seemed possible, already watching the field with the same forward attention as its mother. Harlan had not thought about what was buried under that wall in so long that he had almost forgotten the precise location. Almost. The almost was the part that had kept him awake in the years after, on the nights when sleep refused to settle. He knew exactly where he had dug. He knew because he had stood at the kitchen window the morning after and identified the spot by its relationship to the water spigot on the barn wall and the old fence post that marked the property line with the neighboring field. He had taken those measurements unconsciously, the way a man records something he both wants to remember and wants never to think about again. The fox had settled her den 4 feet from the water spigot, against the base of the eastern wall. He had buried the tin box 14 inches down. He remembered. 14 inches, because that was the depth the frozen ground had allowed him that night in March. He had thought, at the time, that it was not deep enough. He had told himself he would come back and dig deeper when the ground thawed. He had not come back. He had walked past that corner for 40 years and had not looked at it and had not come back. His granddaughter Marin arrived on a Saturday, which was not unusual. She drove up from Philadelphia most weekends, the 2-hour drive that she had never once complained about and that Harlan had never once asked her to make, but that she made anyway with a regularity that he had long since stopped pretending was casual. She brought groceries and the particular brand of tea that Miriam had liked and that Harlan had never had the heart to stop buying. And she sat in the kitchen with him the way Miriam used to sit, with her elbows on the table and her full attention on whatever he was saying. She was 31. She had her grandmother's laugh. He had never told her this, not in those words, but she knew it in the way that people know the things that are most important without being told. He showed her the fox through the window before he said anything else. Marin pressed her face against the glass and went quiet in a way that he recognized as genuine, not polite. She watched the mother and the kits for almost 3 minutes without speaking. There were 4 kits now. He had counted again that morning. "That is something," she said. "Yes," Harlan said. "Are you going to do anything about it?" "The extension office says wait until March." She turned away from the window and looked at him with the expression she had when she thought he was not telling her everything. It was not an accusatory expression. It was patient in a way that had always unsettled him. The patience of someone who is willing to wait for the real answer as long as it takes. He told her about the tin box that night. Not all of it. Not at first. He told her that he had buried something near the barn wall a long time ago, something that he had not thought about in years, and that the fox's presence directly above was making him think about whether it should stay there. She did not ask him what it was. This was one of the things he had always valued in Marin. She understood the difference between information someone was offering and information someone was not yet ready to offer, and she respected the boundary between them with a precision that he had not always found in his own children, who had inherited, perhaps from Miriam, a more direct approach to everything. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he said. She nodded and poured more tea, and they sat together in the kitchen while the night settled over the property and the temperature dropped. Outside and somewhere beneath 4 inches of snow and 14 inches of frozen earth, a tin box sat in the dark, exactly where he had left it in 1984. He had been 37 years old in the spring of 1984. His son Elliot had been 12, and Celeste had been 9, and his oldest daughter, Gracie, had been 17, and Gracie had been dead for 4 months. This was the part he had not told anyone. Not that Gracie had died. Everyone knew that. Gracie had died in a car accident in November of 1983, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, on a stretch of road 7 miles from the farm, where she had been driving back from a friend's house at 10:30 at night. The other car had run a stop sign. The driver of the other car had been 19 years old and had walked away from the accident with a broken collarbone and a guilt that Harlan, in his worst moments, had hoped was permanent. Gracie had not walked away from anything. She had been gone by the time the ambulance arrived. The whole county had known. The whole county had come to the funeral. The whole county had brought food for 6 weeks and had been unfailingly kind in the way that communities are kind when something happens that could have happened to any of them. What the whole county had not known, and what Harlan had not told Miriam, and what he had not told Elliot or Celeste, and what he had told no one in 40 years, was what he had found in Gracie's room in January of 1984, 2 months after the accident. He had been going through her things, not in any organized way, not with any particular purpose. He had gone into her room on a Saturday morning when Miriam had taken the younger children to her sister's house in Lancaster, and he had stood in the middle of the room for 20 minutes doing nothing, and then he had started opening drawers. He had found the letters in the bottom drawer of her desk, under a copy of a novel she had been reading, and a collection of photographs and a small box of jewelry that Miriam would later distribute among Celeste and the cousins. The letters were bundled with a rubber band. There were 11 of them. They were written in Gracie's handwriting on the kind of notebook paper that tears along the side when you pull it out, and they were addressed to someone whose name Harlan had not recognized. He had read them. He had sat in Gracie's desk chair in the cold of her room on that January morning, and he had read all 11 letters. And by the time he reached the last one, his hands were shaking and his face was wet, and he did not know, sitting there, whether what he felt was grief or love, or something he did not have a word for, some third thing that included both of those and something else beside them. The letters were not what he had expected. He had expected, opening them, to find something that would hurt him in the ordinary way that a father is hurt by letters his daughter wrote and never sent, by evidence of a life she had been living privately. He had expected to find the name of a boy he did not know, or evidence of a difficulty she had been navigating without asking for help, or a confession of some kind that he would have to sit with alone. He had found all of that, but the letters were also the truest thing he had ever read about his own family. Gracie had written about him. She had written about the way he went silent when things went wrong, the particular quality of his silence, the way it filled a room without announcing itself. She had written about the night she was 11 years old, and he had come back from his brother's funeral in the middle of February, and had sat in the living room alone for 4 hours, and had not let anyone come near him, and how she had watched from the staircase in the dark, not because she was afraid, but because she was trying to understand. She had written about what it was like to be his daughter, specifically. She had written about it with a precision that made the inside of his chest hurt in a way he had not anticipated. She had written that she loved him in a way she had never figured out how to say to his face. 11 letters, none of them sent, all of them addressed to a name he did not recognize. He had found out later, much later, that the name was a girl who had been Gracie's best friend in 10th grade, who had moved to another state in 11th grade, and with whom Gracie had apparently continued a correspondence that had, at some point, shifted from letters actually mailed to letters written in the privacy of her room and kept in the bottom drawer of her desk, unsent. He had never tracked down the girl. He had thought about it. In the first few years, he had thought about it often. He had imagined writing to her, or calling, or sending the letters, so that someone who had known Gracie could read what Gracie had been thinking. He had decided each time not to do it, for reasons he had told himself were practical, and that he now understood were not. He had put the letters in the tin box. He had buried the tin box in the ground because he did not know what else to do with the truest thing he had ever read, and because reading it again felt like a thing he could not survive, and because destroying it felt like a thing he could not do. And so the third option, the one that was neither survival nor destruction, was the ground. He had put them in the ground and had walked away and had spent 40 years walking past that corner without looking at it. And now a fox was sleeping above them with 4 kits curled against her belly in the frozen dark. Marin stayed through Sunday and drove back to Philadelphia in the late afternoon. Before she left, she stood at the kitchen window again and looked at the barn for a long time. "I will come back next weekend," she said. "You do not have to," he said. "I know," she said. He watched her car until it disappeared down the driveway and onto the road, and then he sat in the kitchen alone and listened to the property settle around him in the cold. That week was a long one. The fox continued her routine with the regularity of something that had decided on a schedule and saw no reason to deviate from it. She left at first light, was gone for hours, returned in the early afternoon with food. The kits were more visible now, tumbling out of the den entrance in the late morning when the sun had warmed the snow to a less hostile temperature, testing the world in small increments. He watched them from the kitchen window with a focus he would not have been able to explain to anyone. He had not had anything to watch from this window in a long time. That was the thing he had not admitted to himself before the fox arrived. The window had always been there, had always framed the same 43 acres, but in the 3 years since the wheelchair, it had become something closer to a painting than a view, a fixed image of a world he was no longer moving through, something to acknowledge rather than observe. The fox had changed that. She had introduced an event, a daily development, a reason to position himself at the glass at specific hours and pay close attention to what was happening in the particular rectangle of the world that remained available to him. He told himself this was about the barn foundation. He was monitoring a potential structural problem. That was the practical framing, and it was not entirely false. But he was also watching a mother tend to 4 small lives, and there was something in the watching that he had not expected and could not quite categorize. There was one kit that was consistently the first to emerge. Smaller than the others, slightly darker around the muzzle. This kit came out ahead of its siblings every morning with the same forward lean, the same immediate assessment of the space outside the den, the same brief pause before committing to the open ground. He had started watching for it specifically. He had not named it, because naming would lead somewhere he was not prepared to go, but he watched for it. The mother handled her kits with an efficiency that was not cold. He had expected something more automatic, the way farm animals were with their young, functional, and brief. But she was deliberate with them. She tolerated being climbed on and bit at and used as a launching platform with a patience that did not read as resignation. When she returned from her foraging runs, she did not simply deposit food and retreat. She stood among the kits and let them investigate her and made small sounds that were below the register. Harlan could distinguish through the glass, but that were clearly not nothing, clearly had content, clearly were information of some kind being passed from one generation to the next in a frequency he was not equipped to hear. He watched this through the kitchen window of the house his grandfather had built, in a chair he had not chosen, on a property he had lived on for 79 years, and thought about what it meant to be unable to cross the 50 yards of open ground between where he was sitting and where they were living. On Wednesday morning, the smaller kit came out and did not stop at the entrance. It moved along the base of the barn wall, away from the den, following the wall with its nose close to the stone, investigating. It reached the water spigot and stopped there, sat on its haunches and looked up at the spigot for a moment with the precise bafflement of something encountering human engineering for the first time. Then it turned and began to make its way back. It was over the buried letters for approximately 12 seconds. Harlan did not know why he counted. He called Marin that evening and told her the rest of it. She listened without interrupting, which he had expected, but she also did not cry, which he had not. He had expected tears, or at least the sound of something softening in her voice, the way voices soften when they receive information that is painful. Her voice was steady through the whole conversation, and at the end of it, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "Grandpa," she said. He waited. "Do you want to get them back?" He had not let himself think about it in those terms. Not yet. He had been thinking about the fox, and about the spring, and about the extension office's recommendation to wait until March, and about the deterioration of the barn foundation. He had been thinking about all the practical perimeter of the question without standing at its center. He said, "I do not know if the paper has survived 40 years in the ground." "That is not what I asked," she said. He looked out the kitchen window into the dark. He could not see the barn. He could see the faint edge of the property line fence and the silhouette of the old maple against the sky, and nothing else. "Yes," he said, "I want them back." She came back that Saturday, as she had said she would. She had done research. She arrived with a printout, several pages, information about archival storage and document preservation and the chemistry of paper degradation in sealed containers at below freezing temperatures. She had talked to someone at a historical society in Philadelphia who worked with recovered documents. She had brought, in a bag from a specialty store, a set of archival gloves and a collection of flat archival sleeves and a small tube of something designed to stabilize paper that had been compromised by moisture. He watched her unload these things onto the kitchen table with a feeling he could not immediately name. "You planned this," he said. "I made some calls," she said. "You planned this before I said yes." She looked at him with a look that was Miriam's. "I planned it for both answers," she said. The question of access was not a simple one. The kits were too young to be disturbed. A mother would not leave a threatened den without attempting to move her young, and moving them at this age was a risk. The archival contact in Philadelphia had suggested that if the container had maintained its seal, the contents could survive the current winter, but that an additional season underground, with freeze and thaw cycles accelerating, would represent a different calculation. March, the extension office had said. Late March for the kits to be mobile enough. He told Marin this. So we wait, she said. We wait, he said. But waiting, it turned out, did not mean what he had thought it meant. In the week that followed, he found himself doing something he had not done in 3 years. He began to write things down. Not the letters, not anything with the formality of the letters. He began with a single sentence on the notepad he kept beside the telephone for grocery lists and appointment reminders. The sentence said, Gracie used to come home from school and go directly to the garden before coming inside. He did not know why he wrote that first. It was not one of the important things. It was not one of the things he would have expected to surface first, if asked what he remembered about her. But it was what came, and he wrote it, and then he wrote another sentence, and then another. And by the end of that first evening, he had filled 4 pages with things that were small and specific, and that he had not thought about consciously in years, but that were, he discovered, not gone. He had assumed they were gone. He had assumed, without quite acknowledging the assumption, that the 40 years of not thinking about them had been a kind of erasure, that silence was the same thing as loss. He had been wrong about this. The details were intact. They were waiting inside him the same way the letters had been waiting inside the frozen ground, sealed, not decomposed, preserved by the very conditions he had thought would destroy them. She had a way of holding a book with both thumbs marking different pages at once, as if she were always deciding between 2 things. She had been afraid of nothing that he could identify, except for one summer when she had been very afraid of the neighbor's dog and would not say why, and the following summer the fear was simply gone, also without explanation. She had asked him once, when she was about 14, whether he thought it was possible for a person to be 2 completely different people at the same time in a way that was not a lie. He had told her he thought it was possible. He had not thought about what she might have been asking underneath the question. He thought about it now. He had been thinking about it, if he was honest with himself, since he had first read the letters in January of 1984, and in the 40 years in between, he had never arrived at a satisfying answer. And it occurred to him, sitting at the kitchen table with the notepad, that the question she had been asking was the same question he had been living with since the night he buried the tin box, just asked from a different angle. The notepad filled. He started another one. Marin called on Thursday, and he told her about the writing, and she was quiet in the same way she had been quiet when he had first told her about the letters. A silence that was not absence, but presence. Will you keep them? She asked. Yes, he said. The fox lost one of the kits in the 3rd week of February. He saw it from the window, early in the morning, the mother fox carrying something from the den entrance that she set in the snow and then nudged once with her nose, and then sat beside. He watched it long enough to understand what he was seeing. The remaining 3 kits came out later that morning and moved around their den without appearing to mark the absence, or perhaps marking it in a way he could not see. He stayed at the window longer than he needed to. That night he wrote, I did not go back to Gracie's room after the morning I found the letters. I let Miriam go through the rest of it. I told her I had already looked, and there was nothing she needed to worry about. She believed me or she did not, but she did not ask again, and I did not go back. He paused. He wrote, I think she might have known. I think Miriam might have known I was keeping something. She had a way of letting things exist without requiring them to be named. I did not understand that about her when we were young. I understood it by the end. He put down the pen. Outside, the property lay in the dark, and the fox was in her den with 3 kits against her side. And somewhere beneath the frozen ground, a tin box held 11 letters from a girl who had been trying to tell him something about who she was and who he was, and what the space between them contained. March arrived with the sound of water. The thaw was not traumatic, not the flooding kind that he had seen some years when the snowpack had been heavy and the melt had been fast. It was a slow thaw, a cooperative one, the ice releasing its hold over a period of 2 weeks rather than 3 days, so that the land came back to itself incrementally, and the mud that followed the ice was the kind of mud that was inconvenient rather than catastrophic. The fox kits were moving more confidently now, ranging further from the den, sometimes 20 or 30 feet along the barn wall in the morning before their mother called them back. The smaller, darker kit was frequently the furthest out. It had developed a habit of sitting in the open field for long minutes at a time, watching the tree line with a stillness that Harlan recognized and could not have explained. Marin came on the last Saturday of March with the archival materials and a shovel, and a confidence that he found both reassuring and slightly overwhelming. They waited until early afternoon, when the mother fox had left on her foraging run and the kits were inside the den. The ground at the eastern corner was soft enough to work, but not saturated. Marin had looked up approximate frost depth for the county for the current date and had determined that 14 inches would be accessible. She asked him if he wanted to do it himself. He looked at the shovel and at his hands in his lap and said, "You do it, but tell me every inch." She dug carefully. He sat 2 feet back in the wheelchair, on the stone path that Marin had cleared along the barn wall earlier that morning when he had still been maintaining that he did not need help. She narrated each inch. 8 inches and nothing. 10, 12, 14, and the shovel hit something that was not stone. Harlan put his hand flat on his knee. "It is here," Marin said. She cleared the earth from around it with her hands. The tin was a coffee tin, the old kind, heavy, and it had been wrapped in several layers of the kind of thick plastic sheeting that farmers kept in their barns in the 1980s for a dozen different purposes. The plastic had held its seal, or most of it. The tin itself showed surface rust, but was structurally intact. She brought it to him without opening it. He held it on his lap for a moment. It was lighter than he remembered, or he was different than he had been, or both. The tin had a slight give to the plastic wrapping, and through the sheeting, he could feel the lid's edge and the body of the container, and something inside that shifted slightly when he tilted it. Marin had brought a small folding table from the house and set it up on the stone path with a piece of archival cloth on its surface. She set out the gloves and the sleeves. He asked her to open it. She cut through the plastic carefully and lifted the lid. The inside was damp at the edges, but the letters were intact, held together still by the rubber band, which had degraded to something brittle and nearly structural rather than elastic. The paper was yellowed, and in 2 places where it had been in contact with the side of the tin, there was a rust stain at the edge, but the writing was legible. He could see Gracie's handwriting from where he sat. He took the first letter and held it in his gloved hands and did not read it. He sat with the paper and the handwriting that he would have recognized in a different country at a different time of his life, and he said nothing. Marin did not say anything either. The sun was moving in the sky the way it does in late March, when the angle is finally changing again, falling at a different pitch than it had in winter, and it touched the barn wall and the stone path and the mud at the edge where the shovel had been, and his granddaughter's face, and the paper in his hands with the same mild indifference. After a long time he said, "She was trying to tell me something." Marin waited. "She wrote about what it was like to be in this family," he said. "About what it was like to be my daughter." He turned the paper in his hands. "I thought, when I first read these, that it was terrible. I thought it was painful and terrible, and I buried it because I could not carry it." He looked up at the tree line, the way the small fox had been looking at it all month. But what she wrote was not terrible. It was true. She saw me true. She wrote about me the way you write about someone you love enough to see all the way through. His voice was steady. He had been working on this for weeks without knowing he was working on it. "I buried the truest thing anyone ever wrote about me," he said, "because I was not ready to be seen that way. I was not ready to understand what she was trying to say." He looked at Marin. She was trying to say that she knew me. She was trying to say it across a distance, in letters she never sent, to a friend who had moved away, because she did not know how to say it to my face. We were more alike than I understood. Marin's eyes were bright. From somewhere around the far side of the barn, there was a small sound, the particular sound of something alive moving through wet grass, unhurried, certain of its ground. Harlan did not look up. "I am going to read all of them," he said. "And then I am going to figure out where her friend is, if she is still alive, and I am going to tell her that Gracie was thinking about her in 1983, and that the letters are real, and that she can have copies if she wants." He lowered the paper slightly. "And then I am going to write one back." They stayed on the stone path until the shadow of the barn had crossed over them and the afternoon had cooled enough to make sitting outside impractical. Marin helped him back into the kitchen and made tea and said very little, which was correct. In the days that followed, he read the letters. He read them slowly, one per day, with the archival gloves on, at the kitchen table. He read them in the morning, when the light was best and the property was quiet, and there was no sound from outside except the ordinary sounds of a farm in early spring, birds returning, the creek running high, the mud drying at its own pace. He read them with the notepad beside him, and when something in a letter connected to something he was remembering, he wrote the memory down, not in any organized way, not in any way he thought would be useful to anyone else, but in the way that a person writes when they are trying to keep something from slipping away a second time. Gracie had not been a troubled girl. He understood this reading the letters the way he had not understood it reading them at 37, sitting in her cold room in January of 1984 with his hands shaking and his face wet. She had been a girl who was paying very close attention to her life. She had been a girl who noticed things, the small things and the large ones both, and who had needed a place to put what she noticed, and who had found that place in letters to a friend who had moved to Ohio and to whom she had been writing less and less often in a format that would actually be sent. She had noticed him. That was the part that had been too much to hold at 37. She had watched him the way he had never felt watched, had seen the mechanics of his silences and his distances, and his way of being present in a house while being somewhere else entirely. And she had described all of it without anger and without judgment and with a love that he had not, at 37, felt himself to be capable of deserving. He was 79 now. He had had 40 more years to work on it. He was not sure he had closed the distance, but he had narrowed it. On the morning he read the last letter, the fox was sitting in the field in the early sun, and her 3 remaining kits were playing in the mud near the barn wall, with the absolute commitment to physical experience that very young animals bring to everything they do. They tumbled and chased each other, and fell over and recovered and began again, and the mother watched them with the same forward attentiveness that Harlan had been watching since February, that look of something tracking multiple things at once, calm and complete. He watched them for a long time after he had finished reading. Then he turned the last letter over in his hands and looked at his daughter's handwriting, the particular loop of her lowercase letters, the way she crossed her T's with a slight right-leaning stroke that he had always noticed on her school papers and had never commented on. He had looked at her handwriting for 17 years before she died and had not told her what he thought about it. He thought, I should have said more. And then he thought, I am saying it now. He found Gracie's friend. It was not as difficult as he had expected. Her name was Paulette Osgood, and she had moved from Ohio to Georgia sometime in the 1990s, and she was listed in no directory that he could find. But Marin, who was more skilled at this kind of search than he was, had found through a series of steps she explained to him, but that he did not fully follow, a woman named Paulette Osgood Harrington, living in Savannah, who was 60 years old, which was the right age, and who had attended the right high school in the right year. Marin had written the initial letter. He had rewritten it 5 times. The final version was 1 page, and it said what had happened and when, and what he had found, and what he had done with it, and why he was writing now. And it said that Gracie had thought about her, and that the letters were real, and that he thought Paulette might want to know. He sent it with copies of 2 of the letters, the ones he judged least private, the ones that talked about the farm and the weather and the particular quality of Pennsylvania winters, things that would tell her that the handwriting was real without showing her everything. Paulette Osgood Harrington called him on a Tuesday afternoon in April, 3 weeks after the letter had been sent. She cried for the first 4 minutes of the call, and he held the telephone and waited, which was what the situation required, and which he was able to do with more patience than he would have expected from himself. Then she said that she had thought about Gracie every year since 1983. She said she had wondered, for decades, whether Gracie had thought about her too. Yes, he said, she had. There was another silence. She said, "Your granddaughter's letter said you were working on something." He thought about the notepads. There were 6 of them now. He had started a 7th. "Yes," he said, "I am writing some things down." "About Gracie?" "About all of it," he said. They talked for an hour. She asked him about the farm and about the family, and about what Gracie had been like in the last years, the things a person asks when they are trying to reconstruct a life they were not present for. He answered what he could. He did not rush, and she did not rush, and at the end of the call, she said she would like to see the rest of the letters if he was willing, and he said he would send them, and he meant it. After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen for a while. Outside, the fox kits were navigating the new grass with the total dedication of their kind. They were larger now, the fur that had been dark and fuzzy in February, now brightening to the orange that would identify them for the rest of their lives. In another few weeks, the county extension office had told him the mother would begin to move him toward independence. They would disperse eventually. They would go in different directions and find their own ground. The den would be empty by summer. He did not think about what he would do with the tin box. He would figure that out later. Right now, it was in the kitchen on the counter, the letters back inside, but not sealed, the lid just resting, the way you leave something when you're no longer trying to contain it. Marin called that evening, and he told her about Paulette. She was quiet in the way she got quiet when something mattered. "Good," she said. That was the right thing. He looked out the window at the field in the evening light, the way the farm settled into dusk, the same way it always had, the shadows coming out of the tree line first, and then moving across the open ground toward the house. "She already knew me," he said. "Gracie did. She saw me clear, and she wrote it down, and she put it away somewhere she thought was safe." Marin waited. "I thought I buried it to protect myself," he said. "I think now I buried it to protect her. I thought if nobody saw it, then the version of me she wrote about might not be true." His voice was even, but it was true. She was right about everything. The silences, the distances, the way I was always present and somewhere else at the same time. She had all of it exactly. He paused, and she loved me anyway. Outside, the last of the day was disappearing into the line of trees at the back of the property, and the property itself had gone the color of dusk, gray-green and still, and somewhere at the base of the eastern wall of the old cellar barn, in the ground that had once held something he was not ready to face, there was now only earth. The fox had known there was something there worth building above. He had spent 40 years convincing himself he had buried it deep enough. The fox had known otherwise.